on using QuickBooks to manage APO chapter finances. During this presentation, I'm going to start with giving some background on me and what makes me qualified to talk about this, and then what is QuickBooks and why we're talking about it, the actual process of implementing QuickBooks, and just some notes on using QuickBooks Online specifically. So my name is Deidra DiVittis. I am the Region H Finance Chair. I have a dual degree in accounting and business management from Carleton University. I also minored in public policy and leadership. I pledged APO in fall 2013 at Alpha Gamma Upsilon chapter at Carleton University. And while in Alpha Phi Omega as an active, I went to every section conference that I could while I was active. So I went to 4 of them. I served as chapter historian, vice president of leadership, chapter president. I was a section conference chair. And I served at the 2016 National Convention Chapter Finance and Operations Reference Committee. And that was the committee that changed the Toast song lyrics. So it was really cool to be a part of that. My professional background includes accounts payable experience and also public accounting experience. I started working in public accounting, doing outsourced bookkeeping and accounting services and some federal tax and audit and assurance stuff, transitioned into state and local tax. Now currently I work at Claris Partners, which is an indirect tax firm. I mostly do sales and use tax and business licensing for corporations now, but my background includes working with small to mid-sized privately owned companies as well as nonprofits. So I've got a pretty comprehensive accounting and tax background. So we're going to start by talking about what is QuickBooks? And why it might be a good idea for a chapter to use it. So QuickBooks is an accounting software, sometimes called an enterprise management software, or you might hear ERP, built for small companies and nonprofit organizations. So it's the perfect thing if an APO chapter or another APO group, such as a section region or alumni group, wanted to use something a little bit more comprehensive than just an Excel spreadsheet to manage finances. It's designed with the non-accounting professional in mind, which is what's made it so big with small businesses. There are some functions that you have to be logged into the software as a professional accountant type user to access. But for the most part, it's super friendly to the non-accounting professional. There are other finance and accounting softwares that are really difficult to use if you don't understand the accounting theory behind all of it. QuickBooks is designed kind of more so for the person who owns a small business or a nonprofit and doesn't know anything about accounting. They're really good at the other thing and they're just using QuickBooks because they need something. So that kind of makes it the perfect thing for college students. You might hear accounting professionals say bad things about QuickBooks, and it's because it's not designed for us. I've used a lot of other softwares that are more so designed for accounting professionals that I like better. But if we're talking about something that college students or the average lay person who's not an accounting professional, QuickBooks is definitely the way to go for that. QuickBooks is developed by a company called Intuit, which also owns Mint and TurboTax. Intuit has 3 different types of QuickBooks that they offer. There's desktop and online, and there's also Mac desktop. The desktop and online versions are very different. There's also some drastic differences between the Windows and Mac versions. The Mac versions weren't being updated for a while, so there's this kind of controversy as to whether or not Intuit's even going to continue putting out Mac versions. They recently released one, I think, for 2019, but that's not really one that's popular and used very much, so it doesn't get a lot of support. But the desktop and online versions are very different. So when you talk about QuickBooks, you kind of can't make a blanket statement about QuickBooks, you have to talk about the specific version of QuickBooks. And even when you get into, okay, I'm using QuickBooks Online, there's a bunch of different subscription levels. So there's some functionality that only exists once you hit a certain tier. And then QuickBooks Desktop has different versions, and they even have industry-specific versions of Desktop Premier. So you could have a manufacturing-specific versus service-specific versus a nonprofit-specific version. So when you talk about QuickBooks, it's really important to make sure that you're talking about the specific program you're using. Just a little disclaimer, I guess. Every version has pros and cons, and there are some versions that are really good for some types of organizations that are really bad for other types of organizations. Personally, I think QuickBooks Online is the best option for an APO chapter or associated group. I'm not talking about the national organization. I'm talking about chapters, alumni groups, region and section groups. The desktop version has things I don't like about it that make it more difficult for an organization like APO to use. And there are other programs like QuickBooks out there, but I think that QuickBooks is just the better option for this organization. So that's all we're talking about today. So now that we kind of know what QuickBooks is, why would we use QuickBooks? Most chapters just use an Excel spreadsheet or Google Sheets to manage their chapter finances and their budget. As your organization grows, there's a certain point where that isn't very manageable anymore, and it's actually really cumbersome to use an Excel spreadsheet. So if you are looking for more detailed transaction history and financial reporting, QuickBooks is a great option. You can easily track your cash flow and figure out where money is coming in and going out. You can have multiple layers of classifications for each transaction. So you can say, okay, this is, you know, a travel expense that's associated with service, and you can pull the reporting to look at it multiple layers. Budgeting is super easy in QuickBooks, and managing your budgets. You can pull reports that show your actual versus budgeted, and a variety of versions of that that make it really easy. And there's even some projection options available too. QuickBooks is way more reliable than using a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet is only as reliable as its last update. So if it's been a couple weeks since it's been updated because the finance committee has all been really busy with midterms or finals, or there's some other event going on, QuickBooks is easier to update, and there's some automation available that makes it more reliable than just using an Excel spreadsheet. You can easily track other chapter assets too. So if you have an investment account or some kind of trust that your chapter owns, or a grant that you're trying to track, QuickBooks is so much easier than doing an Excel spreadsheet for that. You can also have multiple users accessing QuickBooks, and there's an activity audit log. The multiple user access, the reason why I have an asterisk there, depending on what version of QuickBooks you're in, makes it more or less accessible for multiple users depending on how it's stored. So we'll talk about that in an upcoming slide on the different versions of QuickBooks. But it's just something to keep in mind, is that an Excel spreadsheet, you know, you might use a Google Sheet where multiple people can edit at once. But if you don't have Google Sheets, if you're just using an Excel spreadsheet that's saved on your desktop, you're the only one that can edit it and update it. So if two people have copies of that same spreadsheet, it's getting updated in different places. QuickBooks prevents that from happening. There's also apps and add-ons available for all of the different versions of QuickBooks. So you can do other things with it. A good example of this, there's a nonprofit, it's actually a museum that I used to work with when I was doing outsourced bookkeeping work, and they have some add-ons available so they can track their fixed assets and depreciation on them. because that's something that's a really big deal for them. They have to keep track of the value of all of the items in the museum. There's also a lot of really cool apps for QuickBooks Online. There's even some free ones where you can manage a whole host of different things. There's integrations with other programs like Slack even. So there's a lot of really cool things you can check out with that. QuickBooks is also an incredibly popular software globally. So there's lots of support available. So if you're trying to do something in QuickBooks and you can't figure out how, there's all kinds of different forums and third-party resources available in addition to what Intuit puts out. So you're going to be hard-pressed to not find someone who's been trying to do the same thing you're trying to do with QuickBooks. I think that chapters that are close to or over the 990 threshold really should be in QuickBooks or another accounting software. If you're having to do more than just the 990 postcard reporting for the IRS, you're going to really struggle doing that with an Excel spreadsheet or Google Sheets. You need something more intense, more comprehensive, and QuickBooks is the best option for that. On the 990 reporting, there was a newsletter about a month ago that Region H put out that there was a note in there about the 990 threshold. And since we're talking about chapter finances and 990 reporting, I figured I'd bring it up again. The IRS 990 has a $50,000 annual gross receipts threshold for the postcard reporting. If your organization's average gross receipts for the last 3 years is under that 50,000, then you're eligible to file a postcard. It's not a 1-year number. You have to look at 3 years of financial data. If you're over that 50,000 threshold, then you're required to complete a longer form, which requires detailed financial reporting. And most of the chapter budgets and like student organization budgets that I've seen, they don't go down to the detail that the transaction categories are in on the 990 form, and they're kind of looked at a little bit differently than how the average APO student leader would think about money. Having QuickBooks implemented before you reach that threshold will make it easier to do the reporting after you hit it. Another thing, a lot of students are confused on the definition of gross receipts. Gross receipts is not your income or what your chapter earned. Gross receipts is money that your chapter received or collected. So if you did a fundraising event for Big Brothers Big Sisters, and you did like an event with Chipotle, and Chipotle sends the chapter a check for, I don't know, $20,000 from your fundraising event. That $20,000 needs to be included in your gross receipts because it's money that you received. Even though you guys didn't use it, you turned around and gave it to Big Brothers Big Sisters, it still has to be included in your average gross receipts or total gross receipts for the year. So now let's talk about implementation of QuickBooks. So when do you want to implement QuickBooks? When your chapter has over $40,000 of annual gross receipts, I think that's when it's time to start thinking about that 990 threshold and looking at better ways to get more detailed reporting. If your chapter has any investment accounts or high value assets, even if your gross receipts are lower, there are other thresholds and requirements for 990 reporting that might make you ineligible to file the postcard. So if you have certain investment accounts, that might prevent you from being able to file the postcard, and then you should implement a software like QuickBooks. If your chapter has over 200 members and is really struggling with tracking dues, QuickBooks can be super beneficial even if you're not near that $40,000 threshold. And if your chapter has received restricted grant funds, where you have to track those grant funds, and maybe your service team and your leadership team are both using those funds, having QuickBooks will allow you to track those grant funds in a much better way so that you can prove, like, we use this grant funds for what we said we were going to use it for whenever we receive that money. And a lot of grants are really heavily controlled and reviewed, especially if you're getting a grant that's for a specific purpose. You want to make sure that you're not only following those guidelines, but collecting proof that you're following those guidelines. And just a note here on the right, implementing QuickBooks without some type of accounting, bookkeeping, QuickBooks expert to guide you is a really bad idea. I'm not sitting here recommending that any group of college students try to do it on their own. OSU was in this position of worrying about their 990 filings, and they were really struggling with tracking in Google Sheets. That's how they were tracking their budget and their expenses. And I've been working with them for about a year. The chapter is Alpha Iota. And they're, I think I've been honestly really hands off with them. But the things that they do have questions about are things that they wouldn't have been able to figure out without talking to an actual accounting, bookkeeping, tax person to explain to them how the software works and how to do things correctly. So I definitely don't want anybody seeing me putting this out there as chapters should use QuickBooks and then going and trying to do it on your own. Please find an expert. And on that, I'm available to help with anything QuickBooks related for any chapter, even if you're not in Region H. If you're in a different region somewhere else and you're looking for a QuickBooks expert for your chapter, I'm available to help. So just throwing that out there. So like I talked about, there's a bunch of different types of QuickBooks, and I kind of group them into two different categories. There's the desktop application, and then there's the online version. So the desktop application has been around since the 90s. It's a very trusted product. The desktop version is a one-time purchase, and there are industry-specific versions available. So you can get a nonprofit-specific version or a manufacturing-specific version. New versions of desktop are released every year. Intuit, the developer, provides software support for the last 3 versions. So we're currently in 2020. The versions that currently have software support available are 2020, 2019, and 2018. So most QuickBooks Desktop users replace the software by a new version every 3 years. Sometimes they'll go 4 or 5, but that can be cumbersome if you come across a problem. Updating does mean you have to buy and install a new program, but you just have to update your company file to the new program. You don't have to start from scratch when you do that. QuickBooks Desktop does require that the company file is stored on one central location. There are third-party remote desktops. BrightNetworks is a really popular one that is kind of Intuit approved. That's available, but that means that it's more expensive. So even though there is really easy backup with QuickBooks Desktop, and you can manually force backups through if you're going to try something and you don't want to screw anything up, you can back it up before you try to do some kind of import or something like that. It might be difficult to have multiple users accessing that file unless you have some type of third-party remote desktop. And some of those are more expensive, the good ones at least are more expensive than using QuickBooks Online. So for that reason, I don't think that QuickBooks Desktop is a good option for APO groups, especially chapters, because you want to have something that can be easily moved from person to person. And if you are going to put it on more than one computer, you have to have more than one software license. So it just gets very cumbersome and kind of inflates the cost unnecessarily. The Mac version of QuickBooks Desktop is one that Intuit hadn't updated for years, and then either in 2018 or 2019, I think, they updated it for the first time and released a new version. It'd been like 6 years, I think. I don't know much about the Mac version. From what I've heard, it's cumbersome and difficult to use, but I've also heard that the newest version of it is awesome. So take that with a grain of salt. I don't recommend using it, but I also don't know anything about it for the most part. QuickBooks Online is subscription-based online. You access it via a web browser. There is a QuickBooks Online desktop app, which is essentially a special browser that's designed for QuickBooks Online. I found that there are certain types of things that are easier and better to do in a web browser like Chrome versus on the desktop app, and vice versa. There's also a mobile app that you can do limited things on, but the mobile app's really good for things like taking pictures and uploading pictures of receipts, and doing really quick things like that. There's also like mileage tracker add-ons and things like that that you can get that work on the mobile app. There's a free trial available for QuickBooks Online, which you don't really get with desktop. So if you want to try it out, you can for like 30 days with the online version. You can also cancel your subscription at any time. So if you pay for it and then realize like our chapter definitely doesn't need this, you've only lost 1 month of that subscription fee. You can also easily upgrade and downgrade between the subscription tiers. So if you have the most expensive version and you want to, you realize there's a bunch of features that you don't need, you can just downgrade your subscription and then the next month it'll be cheaper. Or if you realize there's something you need, you can just upgrade. And it's just going to change the amount that you're charged every month. You don't have to download a whole new software or go purchase a whole new software. There's also the QuickBooks Online data is stored on Intuit's secure servers, and they are very secure, but backup files are more difficult to access than with QuickBooks Desktop. This is relevant whenever you do something like implement a new app into QuickBooks Online, link a new bank feed, do a massive import of transactions. It's important to be really careful with those because the backup is more difficult. It's more difficult to get to a backed up version because it's a live file, it's online, and it's constantly saving new copies of itself. So you're not going to be able to call Intuit and say, hey, we imported all this stuff and we need to go back to a version that we had an hour ago. They're probably not going to be able to do that like you would with QuickBooks Desktop, but most of the time you're not going to be doing things like that, so it's not really that big of a deal. And like I said before, my professional opinion, knowing everything I know about APO and also QuickBooks, I think that QuickBooks Online is the best option for an APO group. So when you implement, there's some questions to consider that affect which product you should buy and when to make the purchase. Questions like how many users do you need and what kinds of access do those users need? OSU, the Alpha Iota chapter at OSU, they use their subscription is the Essentials version of QuickBooks Online, and it's $40 a month. And it's the second to the lowest tier subscription. They get 3 users and they have 3 people on their finance committee, so it works out really well. You can have an accountant user that is not included in that user count. So I have my own separate QuickBooks Online accountant account with Intuit, and the Alpha Iota chapter has me set up as their accountant, and you can have up to 2 accountants. They have me set up as an accountant, so my access to their system does not count towards their user count. I would highly recommend not setting up anybody with an accountant type user unless they are actually an accountant and actually have that bookkeeping experience and are a QuickBooks expert, because you have access to do certain other functions kind of behind the scenes. And if you don't know what you're doing, you can cause a lot of problems. So that's on that. Think about what kinds of transactions you have to track, what your chapter does. Obviously, you have things like dues, but do you do a lot of fundraising? How is your budget split up? What kinds of categories do you have on your budget? Do you have grants with restricted spending? All of that kind of generates, how do we have to track these transactions? What kind of information do we need to gather from each transaction? What data points do we need to get out of each type of transaction? And then that leads into, what reports are you going to need to generate? Obviously, you're probably going to want to look at budget versus actual reports, but are you going to need a report that just shows, here's all of the transactions associated with this grant, or here's all of the transactions associated with fellowship, or here's all of our spending broken up by each family? You also need to pick a person who will be ultimately responsible for managing the software. I would say that should be your treasurer, but it might be a finance committee chair or somebody else, depending on how your chapter is organized. I would write that into your bylaws and officer description once QuickBooks is implemented and the decision has been made that you're definitely going to stick with QuickBooks. Writing that in as an officer duty is a great idea, because then people know what they're up for. Also figuring out how you're going to pay for it. Can you afford it? Are you going to have a special vote to change your budget to be able to purchase it? Whose credit card do we use for the subscription? Does our chapter have a debit or credit card we can use, or do we have to use a treasurer's or an advisor's or something like that? And then how does it impact officer transition? When we started at Alpha Iota chapter, the treasurer last year, that was a big concern for her, is this software is something she doesn't know anything about. She's not any type of accounting major. How does she transition this and teach somebody else how to use it? So we started from the beginning with having that conversation, and I think that was a really smart idea, and that was something I have to give her credit for, that, from the beginning, she was really concerned with making sure that in the future, the legacy would be built, that their chapter treasurer and finance committee would be able to access the software. And then also picking a start date. Don't decide to do this in the middle of the semester. You can start building it out in the middle of the semester, but it doesn't take that long to set up the file or to set up your company or organization in QuickBooks. I would try to start at least a month or two before your start date. But what I mean by start date is, it's the date that at this point forward, 100% of our transactions will be in QuickBooks. So with the Alpha Iota chapter, we started at the beginning of the semester, and that's the best time, is to pick the beginning of a semester. You don't want to start it at the end of a semester, because then there's the weird stuff that happens over summer. You don't necessarily need to capture that. And it would be best to try to line that up with your reporting year for 990s. But you don't necessarily have to. That's not a big deal, especially if you're under the 50,000 threshold and you're just filing the postcard anyway. But don't make it, a start date of, as of October 1st, all of our transactions are going to be in QuickBooks. That's going to be a nightmare, because you'll have people who have already paid all their dues for the semester and people who haven't. And all of your programming for this semester is already underway. So it would be better to start at the beginning of the semester. So now I have some kind of tips and miscellaneous things I wanted to share about using QuickBooks Online. So the first thing is invoicing. This was a really big deal with Alpha Iota, and I think that across the board, it's something that chapters would have an interest in at least hearing about. With QuickBooks Online specifically, you can customize your invoice templates and have different types of invoice templates. So you can do a separate special kind of invoice for dues, and you could even do like a special new member invoice for pledges. And there's also something called QuickBooks Labs, which I haven't really touched on yet, but QuickBooks Labs is kind of experimental stuff QuickBooks is doing that haven't been implemented into the entirety of the software, but you can kind of toggle them on and off. Gmail has a similar sort of function if you're familiar with that. But the QuickBooks Labs called Import Style allows you to make a Word document template and import that into QuickBooks as your invoice template. And you can select certain fields that QuickBooks updates, like your customer name or your amount due and those types of things. And import style is one of my favorite things about QuickBooks Online. I've used it with a lot of different companies, and you can have a lot of fun with it. A nonprofit client I used to work with, we used import style to put together a letter that we would send to people after they had made donations as a thank you letter. And we did that by using import style, which is really cool, and not really what it's meant for, but it's a Word document. You can import whatever fields you want. So it's kind of really cool. There's also something called QuickBooks Payments, which is really neat. Whenever you email an invoice from QuickBooks Online, if you don't have QuickBooks Payments, it's just an invoice document. So it basically will just send a PDF, and so your brothers can see like, okay, my dues, here's what I have to pay for dues. If you have QuickBooks Payments, that email will come with a button, I think it says Pay Now, where you can click on that and submit payment directly through QuickBooks. And it works very similar to like PayPal or any kind of online store. The really awesome thing about it is if somebody pays through QuickBooks Payments, your invoices in QuickBooks are automatically updated to reflect that they've been paid instantaneously. So that automates a lot of the process and limits what you have to manually go through and do. If you're accepting cash and check payments only, then you have to go and manually update each of those invoices. And if you have hundreds of members, that can be very time consuming. What we found at Alpha Iota, they were using PayPal, and PayPal will send invoices too. So their members were already used to receiving a digital invoice and paying from that invoice to PayPal. We were realizing that PayPal does link with QuickBooks Online, but there were some issues that we were running into with that, and I'm going to get into this in a future slide. But we were having a lot of trouble matching up the PayPal transactions to the invoices that were due in QuickBooks. And we started looking at QuickBooks Payments and we realized that the processing fees on QuickBooks Payments were actually lower than PayPal. So not only did we save some money, we managed to automate the system so that any payments that are made digitally get updated automatically, and nobody has to go through and mark invoices as paid unless they're paid with cash or check. So that was a really cool realization, and saves them a lot of time because they have a lot of members, and it saves them money too because now they're paying fewer processing fees and they have more money to do other things with. So we've talked about tracking income. Now let's talk about tracking expenses. Something really cool about QuickBooks Online, and QuickBooks Desktop has this too. Whenever you're looking at an expense transaction in QuickBooks, you can upload documents to it. So you can upload your receipts for anything, your receipt at the grocery store for supplies for taco night, your gas receipt for travel to an event, anything like that can be uploaded and tied directly to that transaction. So if you're, reimbursing a brother and you're going to put that transaction into QuickBooks as here's this expense, here's the receipt they gave us, you just upload it automatically. And you can even do that through the app, which is like so convenient, especially if you're, sitting at a meeting. I know right now we're all kind of online, but if you just have the actual receipt in front of you, you can snap a picture of it and upload it straight from your phone into QuickBooks. It's amazing. You can also track expenses in a multiple of different ways, just like you can with income. So there's like 3 different buckets of ways for tracking expenses. Your first one is your chart of accounts. This is accounting lingo. This will tell you what type of expense it is. So you've got your office supplies, your travel supplies, entertainment supplies. And then you can turn on class tracking, which you have to have a certain level of subscription to be able to do that. But if you turn on class tracking, now you can track based on your committee or officer's budget or family. Class tracking is really for the different categories your budget is going to be in. So you could have classes of fellowship, leadership, and service. So now you've got travel expenses in your chart of accounts, and you can tag that as a service-related travel expense, or you can tag it as a fellowship-related entertainment expense. And I know like entertainment is probably always going to be fellowship, but that's just an example. You can have multiple layers of those transactions. QuickBooks Online also has something called projects, which are really good for special events. So you can have rush events, youth service day. If there's an event that your chapter does every semester or every year, you can have a project set up if you feel that's necessary. This is really good for if you have special money set aside in your budget or from a grant that supports that event. Then you can set up a project for it. So some examples of this, a nonprofit I used to work with, they do an event, a really big event every year before election day, just to get out, the word about make sure you go vote, So they've had so much success with that when we put them in QuickBooks Online, we set up a project for that election day event so that they can track each type of expense. So they have their food expenses and their entertainment expenses and their security expenses and all of that type of thing, as well as income related to that one event. So I'm trying to remember. my chapter, we would always do like I come from a really small chapter and I'm trying to come up with an example from my chapter, and I'm running out of ideas. For like a region or section, that special event could be your conference, or region volunteer conference, or section conferences. Those could be set up as projects. So then you have your fellowship, service, leadership associated with your project, because conferences have all of those things. And then you can track it in a multitude of different ways. I also noticed that a new QuickBooks lab that's been added is called tags. And I haven't explored this very much, but it looks like it's another way of tracking transactions. So there might be 4 different ways to track them. So you can definitely gain a lot of different types of information really quickly through QuickBooks and not have to manipulate an Excel spreadsheet in a bunch of different ways. Another thing that we're talking about, Region H is considering implementing QuickBooks to manage our region and section budgets. At the national level, each region has their own budget, and the section budgets kind of fall under the region umbrella. So what we're thinking about doing is setting up QuickBooks Online for the region chair and finance chair, which would be myself and Brittany Ramsey. We would kind of manage the QuickBooks program, and then section chairs or section finance chairs or section treasurers, whatever section staff is responsible for money, they could also be users on that. And we haven't talked too in depth in terms of the details of how we would implement it, but that is something we're exploring. So hopefully we'll do that soon, and that'll be really exciting. Another thing QuickBooks can do, make your life easier with, is bank reconciliations. If you are not reconciling your bank account every month, most bank accounts you get a statement every month. Some statement periods vary a little bit different, but every time you get a statement, you should do a bank reconciliation. And QuickBooks Online can almost automate that process. So something really cool that you can do is you can import a bank feed into QuickBooks Online if your bank allows it. There are some banks that, depending on what type of account you have there are additional security measures that make it more difficult to do the linking. So for example, Huntington has certain bank accounts, especially business checking accounts, have a key fob. So people who are authorized users of the bank account have a key fob that like looks like, you know, your car keys, that has a code on it that they have to enter whenever they log in. If you have that, you will not be able to use QuickBooks Online bank feed, but you can use it for credit cards, checking accounts, savings accounts, even certain investment type of accounts. I've heard really good things about PNC, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo linking with QuickBooks Online for the bank feed. What that does is it gives you like a live feed of here's transactions that have been posted to your bank account. And you can either add them into QuickBooks as a new transaction, or you can tie them to an existing transaction. So if I entered a, you know, we wrote a check to Big Brothers Big Sisters for the money we got from this fundraiser event that we did, and then I see that on the bank feed, I can kind of link that with the existing check that we paid out, and that does the bank reconciliation function right there. And if the transaction is not already in QuickBooks, you can add it and create the new transaction. And then what this does is whenever you go to do your bank reconciliation, you might only have to press a couple of buttons. And if you have a lot of transactions on your bank account, this makes it so nice and easy. There is a way to link PayPal accounts as bank feeds. There's not, the way that the information comes across is not linked very well. And what we were finding with Alpha Iota is that it was almost impossible to link the PayPal transactions with their transactions that were already in QuickBooks. And that's why we started exploring other options. We started with QuickBooks Payments, and that made the most sense. But I personally don't recommend trying to do the PayPal bank feed thing because it's kind of a nightmare. At least in the experience that we had. And it is possible that PayPal and QuickBooks have improved that link between their two systems. I don't really know. If you have a lot of transactions that are coming through with PayPal, then that's going to be an issue. And Alpha IOTA has an incredibly large number. I think they had all of their dues, and some of their dues were coming across in multiple payments. So instead of it being, here's the dues that you owe for the semester, somebody's paying, you know, $10 at a time. And then you've got like chapter t-shirt sales and stuff like that, that they just have so many members that there's a lot of transactions, and having to go through, there's this like 16-digit long transaction number that we were trying to go and find and link up between PayPal and QuickBooks. And it was getting to be very tedious and kind of not worth it. So that's kind of my disclaimer about PayPal. But if your checking account does link with QuickBooks, it's amazing. And even if you don't have a checking account that will link with QuickBooks, the bank reconciliation process is a lot easier to do using QuickBooks whenever you have all of your transactions already entered into the software. You just go through your bank statement and like check them off with the software. And it's incredibly easy of a process. So that's all I've got for our webinar. If you have any questions at any point in the future, because I know we don't have anybody listening, please email me. I am here to help. And even if you think like, oh, my chapter is too small for QuickBooks, if you have, if you're still struggling with managing your budget or chapter finances, like please reach out to me, because I'm willing to help even if you're not using QuickBooks. And QuickBooks doesn't make sense for everyone. I know kind of a small number of chapters are going to be in a place where it makes sense for them to use QuickBooks, but there are other things that can be done, and Excel works really well, especially the chapter that I came from. We had, I think at our largest, we had 40 members, and you know, we don't file a separate 990. We were rolled under the universities, and there's still things that you can use Excel for for that kind of a budget and chapter that size. And I'm certainly willing to help anyone who needs it. So please reach out to me if you need help. And also make sure you follow our Region H accounts. And thanks for listening.